All right, well, hello everyone. And again, thank you for your indulgence about class tonight. But I thought since we're not meeting in class, I'd go ahead and just produce a short little video going through some material that we were going to cover tonight on leadership, just to make sure everyone's on the same page and everything makes sense to everyone. Before we get into it, though, just a reminder, if you are watching this video before midnight tonight, on Wednesday, it means that your papers are due, and I know several have come in already, and I'm trying to grade the papers as they come in and get them back to you as quickly as possible. So please make sure you get your alternative solutions papers turned in by midnight tonight. And I will have access to the internet over the next day or two, so I will get those back to you and get some feedback to you as soon as I can. I'm handling the alternative solutions paper in a very similar manner as to which I handled your background paper. I'm not going through and line editing everything. I'm not doing that anymore. But what I will do is I go through, I read your paper, and I'll provide you some feedback in the feedback box in the Dropbox area. So that's how we'll handle that, and you'll be getting your papers back very, very quickly. So the topic we would have covered for this evening session is leadership. And I know you have probably covered leadership in some of your other previous courses. If not in this program, you've probably covered leadership in your undergraduate program. So it's not my purpose to belabor any of this information, but like we have done with everything else in this course, our primary goal is to take the information and then apply that information then to more effective management and governance in the public and nonprofit sector. So the big question tonight is, how can leadership help us be more effective? And what types of models of leadership and theories of leadership are suggested to us by the literature that we can then incorporate into our daily lives to try and make our organizations more effective and more successful. So as we always do with all the topics we cover in this class, we start at the very basic level, the what is level. And so what is leadership? And I think most folks have a pretty clear idea of what leadership is. Leadership is essentially the ability to persuade, the ability to get people to comply with what you want them to comply with, to exercise influence over others, to kind of get people to work together towards some shared vision or some shared goal. That should sound familiar because that type of definition of leadership fits very nicely with what we normally think about when we think about power and the exercise of power. So leadership is the ability to get people to work together to try and achieve some type of shared goal or shared vision. It's the ability to influence, the ability to persuade. There is, however, a difference that the literature makes between leadership and management. Management is tied to the allocation of resources. So when you are managing, you are by definition allocating resources throughout your organization or throughout some level of government. So management is tied to resources and the allocation thereof. Leadership's a little bit different in that leadership is not necessarily tied to the allocation of resources. Now it can be, and leaders can allocate resources. And as we talked about before with organization culture, and we'll talk about again tonight with the material we're covering this evening, is that leaders do signal to their employees the important aspects of organization culture by the way in which they allocate resources. So an allocation of additional resources to one unit within a department certainly would signal to others within that unit that this is something that's important. This program is important enough to get additional resources allocated to it. So leaders certainly can allocate resources, but unlike managers, it's not all about resource allocation. Leaders can provide a vision, they can provide a direction without necessarily allocating specific resources to members of an organization. So I think there is that type of a difference between leadership and management. So tonight we're focused more on leadership and what leadership means for effective governance of organizations and governance of governmental bodies. Now, as always in this class, when we talk about a topic, we go back and take a look at what the literature tells us, because we just don't start fresh with a topic. We have an entire world of literature out there that we can draw upon to help inform our topics and help answer our questions. So there's a huge body of literature that deals directly with the idea of leadership. And so let's take a look at what that literature tells us about leadership. What the literature tells us is that there are several discrete approaches to leadership. The oldest approach to leadership is what was referred to as the trait model of leadership. The trait model of leadership assumes that there are certain personality traits, things like intelligence and foresight, personality characteristics, like enthusiasm and persistence, that there are certain characteristics of individuals that make them good leaders. The implication of that trait model of leadership means that leaders are basically born. They are born with these types of characteristics that will make them more successful leaders. The implication then is that others are not born with those types of characteristics, and therefore, despite all the training that they receive and all the education they receive, will never really truly be good leaders. The problem with the trait approach to leadership is that it argues against teaching leadership in programs such as an MPA program. Well, if you look at MPA curricula around the country, you'll see that the vast majority of MPA programs have leadership courses, and many MPA programs have multiple leadership courses. In a lot of those MPA programs, leadership courses are required courses that every student takes. In some other programs, those courses are elective courses, but everyone has leadership courses. We wouldn't all be teaching leadership if we didn't think that leadership skills could be taught. So I think that the trait model of leadership is not quite as much in vogue as it was perhaps a few decades ago, but the trait model says there are certain characteristics and qualities that make for good leaders. What we have found in the literature, though, as it has moved away from the trait model, is that there's no single characteristic of a person that distinguishes that person from being a good leader versus not being a good leader. And these aren't really boring characteristics. They're more taught types of skills and techniques. The leadership literature really has been guided for many decades by this seminal study that came out of The Ohio State University back in the 1950s. And you've probably seen the Ohio State studies before in their leadership behavior questionnaire. But what they did in the leadership behavior questionnaire is they used it to define two different dimensions of leadership. Consideration for people versus a consideration for structure and task. Basically, they looked at how much leaders value their relationships with their employees versus how much those leaders value getting the job done and being productive as an organization. And that binary dichotomy that was set up by the Ohio State studies tends to be something that has followed through the literature in ensuing decades. And we still kind of refer back to this dichotomy between concern for people versus concern for getting the job done. University of Michigan, a few years after Ohio State, did a very similar study, came to a very similar conclusion, where they also created this dichotomy of concern for people versus concern for task. So how does this concern for people versus concern for task play out in terms of leadership styles? Well, on the chart I have on the screen, you'll see the Blake Moulton managerial grid. You can see the concern for people, the concern for production or getting the job done form the two axes on your chart. So on your y-axis, you have your concern for people running from a low score of 1 to a high score of 9. Concern for production on your x-axis, again, ranging from a low score of 1 to a high score of 9. You see kind of in that pinkish salmon color, if a leader scores low on both concern for people as well as concern for production, that's a type of leadership or management referred to as impoverished. That production is unobtainable, effective production is unattainable because people are lazy, apathetic, and indifferent. Sounds a whole lot like McGregor's Theory X type of an approach to individuals. Conflict is inevitable. Human beings just tend to be lazy. They try not to develop relationships, and there's really not any reason to develop those relationships because, again, they're Theory X employees, and why take a Theory Y approach to managing Theory X employees? So that would be a leader who falls down very low on concern for people and low on concern for production. impoverished. Obviously, where you don't want to be as a leader. If you look at the top of the chart in that green cell, you have what's called country club management or leadership. This is where the leader has a very high concern for their employees. They're very concerned about being liked, forming strong relationships, interpersonal relationships with their employees, but they're not so concerned about tasks. They're not so concerned about production and getting the job done. So it's a friendly place. It's a nice place to work. It's a comforting place to work. But those types of organizations tend not to be very effective. Then you'll see in the middle, you have what is called a dampened pendulum. The dampened pendulum is kind of that middle-of-the-road approach where you score in the middle on both concern for people as well as concern for production. You strive for production, but you don't go all out. You're fair, but you're also firm. It kind of is a middle-of-the-road type of approach. The bottom right in that pinkish purplish color, you have a task type of orientation. People are a commodity. Just like machines, very much like a Frederick Taylor in scientific management, they're cogs in the machinery. And your job then is to plan and direct and control the work of those people who work for you. Again, you're very concerned about getting the job done, not so concerned about the feelings and the development of your employees. Where you would hope to be is in the top right-hand corner with that light blue, the team approach, where you score high both on concern for production as well as concern for people. Production is from an integration of task and human requirements. You combine both together very well in order to be an effective leader. So our effective leaders, according to Blake and Moulton, tend to be those who have a high concern for people, a high concern for production, and tend to work in kind of this team type of an approach and this team type of orientation. Fiedler is a theorist in the literature who kind of gives us an interesting approach to this whole idea of concern for people versus concern for task. Fiedler argues, I think correctly, that leaders need to take a contingency-based approach. That at certain points in time, you need to be more concerned about your employees. At other times, you need to be more concerned about production. My favorite answer, it depends. It depends upon the situation in which you find yourself as a leader. But Fiedler also argues that the way in which someone leads will be dependent upon how they view their employees. And Fiedler uses this approach called the LPC, otherwise known as the least preferred coworker approach. If you haven't run across this before in any of your courses, it's a little bit of an odd type of an approach. It's an odd title for a theory. But according to Fiedler, what you do is you have a leader think about an employee that they would least like to work with. So the type of employee that they really don't want to work with, their least preferred type of employee. You then let that person score that hypothetical employee based upon 20 different factors, and then based upon those results, you can categorize that leader as being either a high LPC leader or a low LPC leader. High LPC leaders are very much relationship oriented. So when they think about their least preferred coworker, even though that's a least preferred coworker, they're going to give that person relatively high marks. By contrast, a low LPC leader is much more task oriented, and they're going to give those least preferred coworkers very, very low ratings. So high LPC, relationship oriented, low LPC, very much task and production oriented. Well, our favorite question in this class is then, well, so what? It's a fun theory, but how do we apply it? The so what is that, again, it will depend upon the situation you find yourself in. In some situations, low LPC leadership approaches tend to work well. In other situations, high LPC approaches work better. So for instance, a low LPC approach tends to be relatively good in very favorable and very unfavorable settings. So at the opposite ends of the spectrum. So if things are really good in your organization, if things are really bad in your organization, that tends to be where this more task production oriented low LPC approach to leadership works well. By contrast, high LPC leadership tends to work well in intermediate situations where you're not at one end of the spectrum or the other. And honestly, that's where most of our organizations find themselves, is in that intermediate, that gray area between the two extremes. And so that's why the high LPC approach tends to work and be most appropriate in most situations, in most organizations, but it will depend upon the situation your organization finds itself in. Hence the reason why we refer to Fiedler as contingency-based theory. So both can be successful, high LPC and low LPC, depending upon your situation. Well, let's drill down a little bit more in terms of the situation in which a leader may find himself or herself in. Think about it in terms of, well, how about your existing relationships with your employees? What do your leader-member relationships look like? If you already have a good bit of trust, then obviously a more high LPC approach might make sense. If you have a very clear task structure where everyone knows what they need to do, again, maybe a high LPC approach might work well. If it's a very uncertain, unclear task, that's where a low LPC, more directive type of leadership style might be most effective. How much authority and power do you have as a leader? The amount of your formal authority that flows from the office that you hold. If you have a lot of authority and you have a great deal of power, it might be easier then for you to build relationships than if you don't have that power base and you have to be a little bit more directive. So it all depends upon the situation in which you find yourself, whether you are more relationship-oriented or whether you are more task-oriented. As always, in all the literature we've talked about in this class, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There is no panacea. It depends upon the situation. Another approach to leadership is what's called path-goal theory. And path-goal theory flows directly through Vroom and the expectancy theory that we talked about last week that you're very familiar with, predicated upon the three concepts of valences, instrumentalities, and expectancies, as we've already discussed. Valences, the amount of value that an employee places upon an outcome. Instrumentality, the likelihood that outcome is going to actually occur, that the leader is actually going to deliver what that leader has promised. And expectancies, the skill set on the part of the employee, that the likelihood that if they put forth the effort, this is what is going to occur. But basically, at the heart of this theory, what you're talking about is the job of the leader is to motivate followers by clarifying goals and then identifying the best path for those employees to achieve those goals. Path-goal theory says if you identify the goal clearly, you provide the path for the employee to achieve that goal, you're going to be a more effective leader. Essentially, what happens is that leaders will manipulate the motivational variables of valences, instrumentalities, and expectancy theories. And by manipulating those motivational variables we talked about last week, you create 4 different styles of leadership. Those 4 different styles of leadership are directive, supportive, participative, and achievement-oriented, as you see on the slide. A directive type of leadership style is just what it sounds like, a top-down kind of a micromanagement, controlling, this is how you do it, and this is what you are supposed to do. Again, directive tends to work really well if you have a very unclear task. If you have a clear task where everyone kind of sees how that task contributes to the goal, then a directive approach is probably not going to motivate your employees and it's not going to be the most appropriate leadership style to use. The second leadership style that grows out of this path-goal theory is a supportive style or a supportive behavioral pattern. In the supportive pattern, you are, again, supporting your employees, providing them with the support that they need to achieve the goals. It's a kinder, gentler, warmer, fuzzier way of leading. It's good if tasks are very frustrating to provide that level of support to your employees. The participative approach, where you go beyond just the supportive approach and you actually allow your employees to participate in the process of how you achieve those goals and coming up with their strategies for achieving the goals. Basically, allow them to participate in finding the path toward the goal. And then achievement-oriented. Achievement-oriented is this self-actualization, this Maslow, this McGregor, this Ardress, appealing to the higher need, the growth needs of employees to try and develop and become all that they can be. It's good if your tasks are not clear to allow people to kind of have this more difficult goal that will then motivate them to work harder, as we talked about last week, by creating the tension that you get from field theory. And that tension then makes people work harder and will be more motivated to then achieve the goal. So the way in which leaders behave under path goal theory, again, will depend upon how clear the task is, how confident employees are in their ability to achieve the goal and get the task done. None of these theories are panaceas. It will depend upon the situation. Then you have what's called the life cycle model approach. And the life cycle model approach is clearly connected to Chris Ardress and his theories on personal growth for employees. Essentially what you have with the life cycle model is the realization that employees mature differently and go through different maturation processes. So the effectiveness of a leader is going to depend greatly on the follower's level of maturity, emotional intelligence, job experience, and so you base your leadership upon the employee you are leading. And so again, we go back to the task orientation versus the relationship orientation. Whether you're a more task or relationship oriented will depend upon the life cycle and the point in that life cycle that your employee currently finds himself or herself at. So in the life cycle model, you are leading based upon the particular circumstances, emotional maturity and intelligence and experience of the employee that you are leading. Life cycle model then again suggests for us 4 different types of behaviors on the part of leaders: telling, selling, participating, and delegating. Telling is like the directive approach under the path goal theory. You tell the employee how to do it, and they do it. Selling, you convince. So this is kind of like a Chester Barnard acquiring the compliance on the part of your employee. So you sell it to your employee. It becomes kind of a transactional type of relationship. And so this is a little bit more of the transactional leadership we'll talk about in a second. Participating, just like with the path goal, it's a participative type of include your employees in determining how they are going to achieve the goal and what path they're going to pursue and determining what that path looks like. And then delegating is linked to the achievement-oriented, again, allowing through a power with approach like Mary Parker Follett, allowing your employees to kind of self-govern and to develop their own objectives and give them the power or help them develop their own power in order to do that. So again, you can kind of see it follows very closely with the 4 behavioral patterns we saw with the path goal theory, moving from a very directive, top-down kind of classical approach to a much more human resource management bottom-up approach with things like delegating and achievement-oriented participation. But you can kind of see how a lot of these leadership theories grow out of some of the other theories that we have talked about earlier in the class, and they're kind of modifications of some of those earlier theories, whether they be motivational theories or organization theories, psychological theories. Those all form the basis then for a lot of these leadership theories we're talking about tonight. Attribution theories. So another category of leadership theories. Those leadership theories taken together will say that leaders will treat employees based upon the track record of that employee. That they will attribute, and they will place blame either on the person or the situation, depending upon the employee's performance record. So if an employee has a good performance record, but something goes wrong, the leader is much more likely to blame the situation as opposed to the employee. They will attribute the problem to the situation rather than attributing it to the employee. The employee has a poor performance record, it's just the opposite. Leaders are going to be more likely to blame the employee as opposed to the situation. So you attribute blame based upon your experience with the employee and how successful the employee has been in the past. You also build relationships with employees based upon your past track record and your past experience with those employees. And that's what's called leader-member exchange theory. So in leader-member exchange theory, we assume that leaders develop unique relationships with each one of their employees. Each one of these relationships is dyadic. It basically is what we call a dyad. So a dyad is a unique relationship between the leader and the employee. So each leader and each employee will form this dyad. The dyad is a social exchange that goes on between the leader and the member. Again, the basic assumption is that leaders will develop unique dyads with each one of their employees. These dyads, or these exchange relationships, usually take on two forms. The one form is what we call a high exchange dyad versus a low exchange dyad. So in a high exchange dyad, it's a relationship that you form with trusted subordinates. So you've already built that trust. It tends to be a very high exchange, high flow of communication type of relationship. Low exchange dyads are formed with subordinates that are not trusted, that don't have a very good track record with the leader. So again, this underscores the idea of it depends. It's going to depend upon the individual member, and each relationship is going to be different. Each dyad is going to be different between leader and member. Again, no one-size-fits-all type of approach. Reaching back to things like operant conditioning that we talked about I believe it was last week or 2 weeks ago, operant conditioning also then contributes to leadership theory, in that it says that the way in which leaders interact with their employees will affect behavior, that the types of consequences, the types of ways in which you interact with your employee will then form the future behaviors of your employees. So operant conditioning, there are consequences that then shape behavior. Social learning theory that we talked about before with Bandura also feeds into this as well, in that people learn from the way in which they interact with leaders. And so leaders kind of look at their exchanges, their dyads with their employees as being a learning moment and a learning opportunity. And so people will model based upon the types of exchanges and relationships they end up having with their leaders. We won't get into a lot of detail on that because we talked about Bandura and social learning theory before, so I think you're pretty familiar with that. Cognitive resource utilization theory, yet another theory that comes out of the leadership literature. This one we'll spend a couple of minutes on because we haven't really talked a lot about this one yet. With cognitive resource utilization theory, we look at the cognitive resources of leaders. Basically, we look at the leader's intelligence and experience and the impact that intelligence and experience will have on the performance of groups and the performance of the organization. We know that when leaders are working in stressful situations, that stress will diminish the ability of a leader to think both logically as well as analytically. But the more experience and intelligence that a leader has, the more cognitive resources possessed by a leader, the more of those cognitive resources a leader has, the more those resources can be used to reduce stress and to kind of give a little bit of breathing room in terms of making decisions. Intelligence and experience do not always operate in conjunction with each other. Intelligence is primarily useful in low stress situations, whereas experience is primarily useful in high stress situations, which when you think about it makes a great deal of sense. In a low stress situation, a leader has time to make decisions, has time to think through issues, and so it can use intelligence as a cognitive resource. However, in a high stress situation, things happen much more quickly. The timelines are compressed. When you have those compressed timelines, you don't have the time to utilize intelligence to think about these issues. You have to react quickly. And when people react quickly, they tend to react based more on their experiences than on their intelligence level. When you have leaders who possess a very high intelligence level and there is very little stress in the situation, that's where we tend to see more directive types of strategies. But again, the way in which you will respond will depend upon the amount of stress and the leader's intelligence level as well as their experience level. Stress will have an impact upon whether intelligence or experience carries the day in terms of how the leader will interact with their employees and the types of decisions that leaders will make. So again, you have to tailor what you are doing as a leader to the situation in which you find yourself. So all these theories taken together, where has that kind of left us with the current state of the leadership literature? Where those theories have left us is they have left us with a pretty neat and tight typology of 3 different main leadership styles, which you've, I'm sure, run into before. Transactional leadership, transformational leadership, and charismatic leadership. Now, we're familiar with transactional leadership. Transactional leadership is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's this transaction, this exchange that goes on between leaders and their employees. It's like a Chester Barnard. The leader provides the incentives, and those employees, when they receive those incentives, if they have the right valence level placed upon those incentives, those employees will then provide contributions back to the leader and the organization. So it's a transaction between incentives and contributions. As Barnard tells us, in order to achieve a satisfactory level of satisfaction among our employees and productivity, we need to have a balance between those incentives and those contributions. As Adams tells us with equity theory, the inputs and the outputs must at least balance in order to maintain satisfaction and a feeling of equity among our employees. So transactional, this actual exchange between leaders and members. Transformational obviously is different in that transformational relies upon power, but not in terms of providing incentives necessarily. It's not a controlling, centralized type of power, but rather it's more of a working with employees to try and get them to that level of self-actualization, to work with employees to try and show them how their efforts can then lead to their goals as well as organizational goals. Very much about empowerment, bringing a vision, bringing an idea that everyone can work together into the organization. We know that the most effective leaders need to combine both transactional as well as transformational leadership. At certain times with certain employees, you're more transactional. At other times with other employees, you can be more transformational. Usually what happens is that transformational leadership usually consumes more capital on the part of leaders than transactional leadership. And there's a whole body of literature in political science, a really interesting body of literature that looks at city executives, whether they be mayors or whether they be city managers and administrators, and kind of categorizes them based upon how transactional versus how transformational they are. In the literature, mayors who are kind of the transactional types of mayors, they fall into a category that the literature calls brokers. They're always brokering deals with their employees or with the interest groups or with city council members. They're always brokering deals. If I give you this, you give me that. Those types of brokering types of mayors, those types of transactional mayors, those are the ones that tend to last longer in their positions because they don't really risk a whole lot, but they don't accomplish a lot either. They kind of keep the trains running on time, so to speak. They maintain the status quo, but they really never accomplish any vision. The transformational types of mayors, those are the ones who are referred to as the entrepreneurial mayors. Those are the ones who come into their position with something to achieve. They have a goal, they have a vision, and they try to get people to follow them toward achieving that goal. They expend the political capital that is necessary to get people to achieve a goal. Obviously, when you're expending that much political capital, you're probably going to burn out relatively quickly. And these entrepreneurial mayors tend to have more success achieving goals, but they also tend to have much shorter tenures in office. And that same type of idea, the corollary to that is with city administrators as well. So if you're a city manager, a broker city manager, you may last a couple of decades in the city. Entrepreneurial city managers, you may last a couple of years if you're lucky. But that's kind of how that transactional versus transformational dichotomy sometimes plays out with city executives. So again, transformational leaders have this idealized influence. They use intellectual stimulation. They have consideration for their individual employees, and they kind of motivate through inspiration. And that's kind of your transformational type of leader. Your transactional leader, their leadership's based upon contingency-based rewards. You do this, and I give you this. But again, we hope that we're transformational as leaders, but we need to realize the literature tells us it depends upon our situation. Sometimes we're transformational, sometimes we're a little bit more transactional. And then there's charismatic leadership. And we've talked about charismatic leadership before. The group exercise I usually use in this for this class session is that I have the groups come up with examples of charismatic and transactional and transformational leaders. And almost every group without fail is able to identify charismatic leaders. That almost everyone's had this type of a relationship. Charismatic leadership is kind of an extension of transformational leadership, where we look at the attributes of that leader, the personal characteristics and the charisma of that leader, and the leader kind of leads based upon their personality. There are two strains within charismatic leadership. There's attribution theory, and then there's self-concept theory. Attribution theory or charismatic leadership argues that people are more likely to follow leaders who advocate a vision that is different than the status quo, something they can get behind. Attribution theory says that they tend to follow leaders who are relatively unconventional, who demonstrate self-sacrifice, who have confidence, and who are persuasive. Basically, these are the types of characteristics that followers would like to see within themselves. And so that's kind of why they follow these leaders. Self-concept theory of charismatic leadership says that people tend to follow leaders who they personally identify with. So if I can kind of identify with that person, they feel they're kind of like that person, they share the same beliefs as that person. That's kind of the more self-concept theory, that they follow someone who they are similar to. So you either follow someone who you respect their characteristics and would like to be like them in attribution theory. You follow a leader who you are kind of like in self-concept theory. But either way, leaders then lead based upon their personality, based upon their charisma. As we've talked about before, the great thing about charismatic leadership is it usually creates and engenders great loyalty among followers. The disadvantage is that the power base is transient, in that once that person leaves his or her office, power then goes with that charismatic leader rather than residing within the office. Power is in the person rather than being in the position with charismatic leadership. Well, whether a leader is transformational or charismatic, leaders usually lead by bringing culture into their organization or by modifying the existing culture within the organization. And that's one of the best ways that you can transform an organization, is through transforming its culture. And we have talked about organization culture before when we talked about organization theory, so I'm sure you remember it. Sheen is the author that we talked about when we talked about organization culture. And just as a refresher, We said every organization has its own unique culture, just like a society has a culture, an organization has a culture. And the way in which we see that culture is we can see that culture manifest itself in artifacts, in values, and in basic assumptions. The basic assumptions are at the core of the organization. They are very deep within the organization, and they are very hidden. So the assumptions are basically what we believe. We don't talk about it, but these are the norms and the values and the ideals that we kind of hold as members of this organization. It's much more difficult to drill down and see these basic underlying assumptions because they're usually not spoken. The intermediate level are those espoused values. And so the things you see in a mission statement, in a strategic plan, in a code of conduct, those are the espoused values. So these are the things that we as an organization are going out there and telling people, this is what we believe, this is what we are in business for. So it's not quite as deep, it's something that's more visible. Artifacts, the third level of organization culture, these are the very visible things that are produced by the organization. So minutes, agendas, those types of things, those are artifacts. We can actually look at those and understand the culture of the organization and what the organization does and how that reflects what the organization values on a daily basis. So leaders have the ability to shape the culture of their organizations. Effective leaders are the ones who are able to bring a new culture into the organization, or at least revise the existing culture of the organization. So the question then becomes, how do they do it? How does a leader communicate culture? Leaders can communicate culture in a variety of ways. They communicate culture through symbols, physical objects and settings and roles within the organization. Those are all symbolic communication of culture. The types of language used in the organization also communicates culture, slang and slogans and jargon. Narratives, the legends, the urban myths and the sagas, those types of things help to communicate culture. Practices and events. And a lot of people are talking about this in their papers as maybe solutions to enhance motivation, or things such as special events to recognize performance, recognize employees. Those types of events can also then communicate culture to employees. So when you are a leader, you have a lot of strategies at your disposal for embedding and reinforcing the culture you want to instill within your organization. And effective leaders are able to embed culture effectively within their organizations. You make clear what you ignore and what you measure and what you control. That's a way in which you can embed culture. How you react to critical incidents and crises sends out those cultural messages as well. Role modeling and teaching and coaching, the social learning Bandura type of an approach, that's a reinforcement of culture. Establishing the criteria for advancement and the criteria for punishment and punitive measures, that communicates culture. Coordinating the design and structure of the organization communicates culture. How you coordinate your organization system also then will communicate culture. How you design your physical space communicates culture. And there again is a whole body of literature. If you've ever done any work in housing policy, you know that there's a whole segment of housing policy that speaks to the impact of environment on behavior, the impact of physical space on behavior. And the classic example that comes out of that literature is the Pruitt-Igoe housing project, and how the Pruitt-Igoe housing project was poorly designed and was designed without much consideration for the impact that design would have upon the behavior of residents. And so you had situations in the Pruitt-Igoe structure where it was a tall building with lots of floors. To save money, the elevator did not stop on every floor. Elevators would stop on even numbered floors. So if you lived on an odd number floor, you either had to if you lived on the 9th floor, you had to take the elevator to the 8th floor and then walk up the steps, or take it to the 10th floor and walk down the steps. Well, the idea was, you can save time and be more efficient by only having the elevator stop on even numbered floors. But think about the impact that that type of physical design then has on the residents who live on those odd number floors. And so the type of physical space and how you design it has a clear impact upon culture. In my district, we recently, I think I mentioned to you, redesigned our fiscal services area in our district office. And the reason for that is to open it up, because in the past everyone had their own little office, and now it is opened up. It's a more free flow so that people can interact with each other again to try and build culture within that department. The stories about events and the people can certainly communicate culture. Your formal statements about organization philosophy will communicate culture. And you really need to approach this whole idea of cultural leadership as some type of comprehensive organizational change, that it's something that changes the foundations of the organization. Because if it's something that people see you're coming in just doing superficial things, just, putting paint on a wall or something like that, that's not really going to get the job done. It has to be more holistic and organic and comprehensive than that. But effective leaders are leaders who are able to engender the type of culture that they want within their organizations. So when we look at our public leaders, we hope that our public leaders will be entrepreneurial, that they will be able to take on the responsibility of engendering new cultures in their organization and being these transformational types of leaders. Rainey gives us this adaptation of what he calls the entrepreneurial typology of public leaders, based upon a leader's skill set versus a leader's commitment to programmatic goals. You can see those leaders who score very low on commitment to goals and low on skill level are what he calls the survivors. These are the ones who just really don't get anything done, but their primary goal is just to survive in their position to keep their organization going. Those who have a skill set but are not very committed to the goals of the organization are your more generalist types of managers or leaders. Those who are very committed to programmatic goals and score very high on that are your program zealots. Those who are high on both commitment to goals and commitment and skill level are what we refer to as your entrepreneurial leaders, your loyalists. These are the leaders that tend to have the biggest impacts upon their organization. But effective leadership is also going to be impacted by situations. That's the common theme, not just of what we're talking about tonight, but the common theme of the entire class. That what you do and how effective you can be will be predicated upon the situation, the contingency in which you find yourself. So leaders need to manage based upon group dynamics, based upon conflict, based upon communication systems in their organization. All those issues will have an impact upon how leaders lead and how effective leaders can be. Groups, as we know, are very important in organizations, not just formal groups, but informal groups as well. We know some groups, the formal groups, are actually within our organizational chart. They are groups that have some formal authority, and exist from 1 year to the next. But we also know we have informal groups that grow up as well. Elton Mayo told us about the impact of group pressure upon performance. So leaders must be able to manage not only their formal groups, but also their informal groups, because both formal and informal groups will have impacts upon organizations. Groups will form their own goals. And if those goals run counter to the goals of the organization, then you're going to have a problem with effectiveness and productivity. So how then do leaders manage these groups productively in order to contribute to organizational goals? Well, in order to do so, leaders must realize that groups can have both their advantages as well as their disadvantages. The positive aspects of groups is that groups oftentimes can outperform individuals because of this collective availability of resources. You put a lot of people together with all these cognitive resources, they can sometimes be more productive than one person with that one person's own set of cognitive resources. Group dynamics can be motivational. in that group members can put pressure upon other members of the group if they're not pulling their weight. The interaction you get in those groups can foster knowledge and creativity. Mary Parker Follett, interpenetration of ideas and integration can come out of these types of group settings. We also know that groups can tend toward groupthink, and we'll talk about that in a second, but that is a major dysfunction of a lot of organizations. We also know that groups can engender the wrong culture, that you may be trying to engender a certain culture in your organization, but you may have groups that are operating counter to that. They have developed their own cultures that run counter to the organizational culture you want to foster. We also know as groups become larger, they become more prone to free riders, those who are getting the benefits of belonging to that group without putting forth the effort and paying the price and the cost that it takes to maintain the group and keep the group going. We know that effective leaders can impact groups and hopefully enhance the positives while minimizing the negatives. But again, one of the major negatives of groups and organizations is the creation of this thing called groupthink that you're familiar with before, or you've talked about before. Janice talks a lot about groupthink and what groupthink is. Groupthink is a type of thought exhibited by group members to minimize conflict and reach consensus without ever critically evaluating ideas. They tamp down any ideas that run counter to the ideas of the group. You really get into this type of bubble mentality where you never really critically analyze other ideas that may be a more appropriate way of achieving your goals. The groupthink is basically a decision-making shortcut. Leaders can avoid groupthink in a variety of different ways. They can encourage members to act as evaluators. Sometimes you assign members of your group to come to a decision independently. The one thing, I won't go through them all, but the one thing I like the best is the one at the bottom. Assign a member to play devil's advocate. When you have someone who, despite what the rest of the group is saying, say, well, what about this? Well, what if this happens? And really force the group to think critically and to evaluate other ideas to help break this whole mentality of groupthink. And so it's important to try and avoid that as one of the major dysfunctions of groups within organizations. We also know that leaders are only effective if they can create an effective communication system within their organization, because they can decide and they can dictate how information is passed on within the organization. They can dictate the impact of that information on outcomes. They can dictate who has access to the information, who plays a role in how that information is transmitted. So how you manage communication will have a big impact upon your effectiveness as a leader. We know that leaders run into a lot of problems with effective communication. There are a lot of barriers to effective communication. We won't go through everything that's listed on the screen, but things such as a lack of feedback, noise in communication that disrupts the transmission of what you are trying to transmit, misuse or misunderstanding of language in communication, listening deficiencies that people don't really want to hear what is being told to them. Those are all barriers to effective communication that leaders have to deal with. There are barriers to effective communication between groups as well, when it becomes kind of a zero-sum game between groups, where one group has to win and one group has to lose. Both groups can't win. That type of zero-sum game will have a major impact and be a major threat to effective communication within your organization. So again, I'm not going to go through all of them. They're all provided on the slide there for you. But just to underscore the importance of communication, that leaders must engender an effective communication system within their organizations. And then conflict. How leaders manage conflict will have a direct impact upon the effectiveness of that leader and the effectiveness of the organization. We know from reading Mary Parker Follett, and I warned you early in the class that I like Mary Parker Follett, and she tends to come back and visit us throughout the course. As Mary Parker Follett tells us, conflict is a natural part of a democracy and hence a natural part of a democratic organization. Conflict is going to exist. It's how we deal with the conflict that is important. We can deal with conflict in a way to make it productive, but only if we manage it correctly. If we ignore it, conflict is going to end up being disastrous for the organization. So conflict is inevitable. We must expect that conflict is going to occur. We must know how to manage that conflict. So how do you keep conflict healthy? How do you use it to your advantage? One way that you can use it to your advantage is by encountering it early in the process. And there are several different stages to conflict. Conflict can be horizontal, it can be vertical. It can be between individuals, it can be between groups. It can be because people in groups have different goals or different values, different priorities. So there are a lot of reasons why we have conflict. But what we need to do as leaders is we need to encounter that conflict as soon as we can at the proper stage of that conflict. Now, there are several different conflict stages. There's latent conflict, and in latent conflict, basically the conditions are ripe for conflict, and it's waiting to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. So it's kind of latent, it's kind of out there. Perceived conflict is when people start to sense conflict, but they're in denial mode. They're not really feeling discomfort from it yet. They kind of feel that it's out there, but they're more willing to ignore it. It's not causing them any pain or discomfort. Felt conflict is when conflict is actually being experienced as discomfort. Tension, anger in the organization, that's felt conflict. Manifest conflict is basically open warfare. This is where you have people and you have groups going at each other. You have winners, you have losers. This is where if you don't intervene, conflict is going to become destructive for the organization and will detract from the effectiveness of the organization. Then there's the conflict aftermath stage. After the outbreak of conflict, this is where we kind of see the fallout. This is where we see all the damage that has been created by the conflict. So again, looking at the different conflict stages, latent to perceived, to felt, to manifest, to conflict aftermath, where we need, I don't have this slide on there, but where we need at the very latest to intervene as a leader is in manifest conflict. If we don't intervene at that point, that's when we're going to have problems. Hopefully, effective leaders are able to intervene at an earlier part. And so whenever you have felt conflict, hopefully if you intervene at the felt conflict stage, you can keep it from progressing to manifest conflict. If you're even able to intervene at the perceived conflict stage, you can keep it from progressing to felt and manifest conflict. So usually the earlier you can intervene, the better, but the latest that you'll intervene will be at that manifest stage of the conflict process. How then do you intervene? Well, you intervene in different ways. And the way in which you intervene in a conflict will depend upon two primary criteria. Your concern for your own goals as an individual and your concern for the goals of the group. You can see on the chart there, you have your x-axis, concern for group goals, your y-axis, concern for your own goals. If you score low on both concern for your own goals and concern for the group's goals, you're in the avoidance category. Just leave me alone. I don't want to deal with it. I'm just not even going to admit that it even exists. Clearly not where you want to be. Concern for your own goals, you score high there, but low on concern for group goals, competition. This is your zero-sum game. I'm going to try and win. You're going to end up losing. Compromise, if you score in the middle range on both of those indicators, meet you halfway. If you score high on group goals, but very low on concern for your own goals, accommodation, you will give in just to get the conflict remedied. Where you hope to be, obviously, is collaboration, a concern for group goals as well as concern for your own goals. This is the interpenetration. This is the integration way of dealing with conflict, according to Mary Parker Follett. Remember, Mary Parker Follett argued there's domination, there's compromise, and there's integration. The domination is the competition, the compromise is the compromise, the collaboration then is the interpenetration and the integration. So again, the latest place in which you want to intervene is going to be at the manifest conflict stage. But the earlier you can intervene, the earlier you can reduce the conflict or rechannel the conflict, usually the better for effective managers. So what does this all mean then for public organizations? Because like we have always done in this class, we need to highlight the unique nature of the public sector, because a lot of what we talked about tonight with leadership applies well in the private sector as well. So what then makes it different than in the public sector? Well, clearly being an effective leader in the public sector means you need to recognize the fragmentation of power and the fragmentation of decision making. As a leader, you are never going to be manifested with all the power in the world. If you're the CEO of a corporation, especially if it's your corporation, you're going to have almost unlimited power as a leader. Obviously, as a public manager, you serve many masters. You have fragmentation outside your organization as well as inside your organization. It's really going to limit your resources that you have to exercise an effective leadership. We know in the public sector, the good thing is that we tend to have a much more diverse workforce, diverse backgrounds, cultures, and interests. And so it makes it more difficult, perhaps, for you to know each of your employees, but it's important that you know and understand each employee. It's important that you create these individual dyads with each one of your employees, which can be a little bit more challenging in the public sector as compared to the private sector. All the rules and regulations, reporting requirements will also place limitations upon us and our ability to make decisions as leaders, our ability to hold ourselves and our employees and our organizations accountable for actions. As we know, goals are much more difficult to define in the public sector. So if you're looking at a path goal type of a theory to your leadership style, it's going to be more difficult for you to identify the operational indicators for that goal and then to communicate those indicators to the members of your organization than if you were working in the private sector. And then we also know in the public sector, the tasks that we do tend to be much more service-oriented, they're much more human-oriented, and they're much more information-intense. It's kind of what a Thompson would refer to as an intensive approach to the technologies that we use. That we are not just kind of doing what he would call the long linked approach, where you're just, in a factory type of thing, putting this part on a car and then it moves down to the next stage and another part is put on. It's not that factory type of analogy, and that we're much more service oriented in what we do. It's a much more intensive type of technology. The way in which we deal with individuals outside as well as inside our organization will vary. And these individual dyads that we create are going to be much more complex usually in the public sector than what we normally see in the private sector. So I think the moral of the story for effective leadership in the public sector is it is not impossible, but it is much more difficult because we don't have nearly the power and the authority and the control that we would normally have in the private sector. But where we strive to do as leaders in the public sector is we strive for more transformational leadership with the recognition that we may not always be able to be transformational. And that at times, based upon the situation that we are facing in our organization, sometimes we have to take a more transactional as compared to transformational approach. Really, what controls the literature today is a situational-based leadership approach, that we lead based upon our situations. So no surprise to you with this information as well, like all the other information covered in the class, we come back to it depends. And to be an effective leader, we must be able to understand the unique situation of our organization, the unique culture of our organization, the unique situation of our employees, how we deal with our environment. We have to take all that into consideration in determining which theory of leadership to use. We usually trend toward transformational leadership with the recognition that we cannot be transformational 100% of the time. So I thought it would be useful just to go through these slides and provide you with some of this information since we were not having class tonight. I hope some of this is clear to you. I hope that this is helpful to you, especially in terms of writing your paper and selecting that final solution that you'll then be advocating in your paper that you'll be turning in next week. I will get your alternative solutions papers back to you as quickly as possible, again, without line edits, but I will provide you with some feedback in terms of your solutions and whether I think your solutions are realistic. If I see any issues in terms of the potential implementation of your solutions, I will point that out to you as well so that you can take that information into account. And then for your final solution paper, you will be selecting the one out of those 3 solutions you think will work best. If you believe that a combination of solutions is more applicable, you can certainly combine 2 or maybe all 3 of the solutions together. It's completely up to you, and whichever approach you think would be the best approach or the most appropriate approach for dealing with the problem that you are dealing with. Now, again, in that final paper you're going to turn in next week, if you have any questions about that, feel free to email me. What I'm going to focus primarily on will be the final section, that one solution that you are selecting and your justification for why you are selecting that solution. You will also, as part of that paper, be submitting your revised background paper and your revised alternative solutions paper. But honestly, where I will focus most of my attention will be on that third part, the new part. Here is the solution I am selecting, and this is the justification for why I am selecting that solution. But as I said, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I will make this link obviously available on our Canvas site. Hopefully everyone will be able to get access to it. And any questions at all, let me know. Otherwise, we will be back together again next Wednesday on August 15th for our final class session. We will talk organizational change. We will do a wrap-up to the information in the course. If we have time, we'll do a group exercise. If not, we'll just go ahead straight to course evaluations and then let you go a little bit early next week so you can then finish up your final paper and get everything done for the course. I hope, again, that this has been useful. Any questions, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, watch the video, and hopefully it will be helpful for you. Take care.